We're here today as part of the DARGchive project, and we're speaking with Professor Michael Billig. Professor Billig has been a member of staff here in the Department of Social Sciences at Loughborough University since 1985, and in 1987 he was one of the founding members of the Discourse and Rhetoric group. His books include such notable works as Arguing and Thinking, Banal Nationalism, and most recently, Learn to Write Badly. Professor Billig, thank you very much for agreeing to talk with us today.
My pleasure.
So, the questions that we've got are roughly chronological. So, with that in mind, I'd like to start by asking you, what was this department like before the Discourse and Rhetoric group?
Well, it wasn't that the Discourse and Rhetoric group made the department suddenly different. It was different for a lot of reasons. Basically, it was much smaller, and the university was much smaller. It was a much quieter university. In some ways, the department being smaller, it was a friendlier department, but it wasn't as well recognised by the university as it is now. The university in those days saw itself very much as a technological university. And the head of department, Adrian Webb, had been given a warning by the Vice-Chancellor that unless the department improved, it would be closed down and the various units would be scattered elsewhere. And Adrian Webb, in the year before I came, did wonderful things in saving the department and building it up. And he built up 2 research groups. One was in social policy, which is still going and was enormously successful, and the other was amongst the sociologists, work and employment group. Both those groups were set up in order to attract funds and to bring funded research to the department. And that they were very notable steps, and in some ways I think more notable in the history of the whole department than the founding of the DARG, which really was very low key when it was founded.
Okay. And just to expand it out a little bit, so what was the research culture surrounding things like discourse analysis in the UK at that time before DARG started? Were there other groups like DARG already in existence?
I don't think so. I don't really know. I led a very isolated academic life. I was at Birmingham University. I went to the university, did my teaching and went home. I never went to conferences or had any other contacts. So I really couldn't say. I have found out that there was a very, very important group of critical discourse analysts in Essex.
So this is the big loading question, but I'll just ask it. How did DARG start?
Oh, it's not loaded. I don't know if anyone else has told you, it was Derek Edwards' idea. He knew that I was interested in rhetoric, and he was interested more generally in interaction and conversational interaction. He'd just completed a book on children's classroom talk, a superb book, and he knew there were several others in the department and outside the department who were interested in studying language, and he said, why don't we set up a group just to bring people together and talk about their various interests in language.
Okay. So I suppose you've already kind of touched upon this, but I was wondering if you could expand a little bit. So it was a formal attempt to create a research group from the start? It wasn't something spontaneous that was later...
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. It was just an attempt to bring people together who might or might not have common interests and would be interested in each other's work. It most certainly wasn't an attempt to set up a research group to parallel the work and employment research group or the research in social policy group, which were set up to promote funded research. This was not. This was just for people who may or may not be like-minded to get together and talk about their interests.
Okay. So what were the early DARG sessions like? Obviously now DARG is very much to do with analysing data and so on. Were those early sessions the same?
Oh, absolutely not. No, not at all. They were about talking about our interests. We had diverse interests. After a while, we hit on the idea, I think it may have been me, about collaborating on a book which would express the points of contacts and indeed the points of disagreement. That was the book Ideological Dilemmas. And it's significant that a couple of the people who collaborated on that didn't continue in DARG. They felt their interests were in different directions. That's Mike Gain, particularly a superb sociological theorist, very, very well-read person, very scholarly, and Alan Radley, who was a very creative, qualitative social psychologist, and I think he was happier working on his own, and his interests weren't in language as such. Also in that group at that time was Susan Condon, who was in the department, I think, for a year, and then went off to Lancaster and subsequently came back and has now gone off again. And she contributed the chapter on gender in that book.
So how did DARG transition from being this small research group, as you've mentioned, to being this larger project? Presumably there wasn't email promotion like there is now and so on back then.
Yeah, I wouldn't even call it a research group. It was a group of people talking about interests. A research group often implies that you have research projects. Apart from writing the book together, we had no project, and when that was finished, I think we all felt a sense of relief. It was a way of discovering what our interests were. The real big difference came with postgraduates. The thing about being a small, friendly department is that we had very few postgraduates, and for one or two postgraduates would come along and make their contribution. Ros Gill, who's now professor, I think she's at City University, very successful career in media studies and communications. She was an early postgraduate there, very, very bright. And it was Celia Kitzinger, after she was appointed, who really brought, she had a genius for bringing in postgraduates. Suddenly, the university had let it be known that it'd be good for departments to have postgraduates, and she went out over a summer and came back with about 10. I don't know how she did it, but that changed things. We had to go in a different room, and the dynamic changed because of that. It then became, as much as anything, a means of teaching.
So, I think you've already touched upon this a little bit, but just to ask a little bit more, who were the early non-founding DARG members who came along, both staff and PhD students?
I can't remember all the PhD students, I'm afraid. I can't remember. Oh, yes, I can remember. One notable of Celia's PhD students, of course, was Liz Peel, who has returned. And of course, the big member of staff who came was Jonathan Potter. And again, his presence contributed enormously, and I think he had a much clearer vision than any of us about developing the group. I think both Derek and I were just prepared to bumble along and chat and pursue ideas, but I think Jonathan saw the possibilities of something much more focused and something much more directed.
Who were some of the other figures who were influential in the early days of DARG?
there's two people I really do want to mention. One is Dave Middleton, who worked with Derek and was initially very interested in activity theory, and he brought some of the ideas of activity theory into DARG, and just was a lovely person, so enthusiastic, and remained attached to DARG until he retired. The other person, who was very creative, an unusual academic, was Malcolm Ashmore, who came from the social studies of science background, which in fact Jonathan came from the social studies of science. He didn't really come from linguistics or discourse analysis. And Malcolm, he first of all wrote with Jonathan and Derek a wonderful article called Death and Furniture, which was attacking, was the anti-relativists. It was often misunderstood as being arguing for relativism, but it was more anti-relativism. And Malcolm had a quirky mind. He was never going to go along the conversation analysis line, because that would be too much of a restriction for him. A very playful mind, a very creative mind. And sometimes, like many creative academics, he would get lost for a while. He wouldn't quite know what he was doing. And that's nice. And you lose that if you get a research group which is so confident in itself, and which is saying, this is the way you've got to do, these are the methods you've got to have. It becomes safe, and it means people don't lose themselves. And unless people run the risk of losing themselves, they're not going to find real gems. That's just my view.
So, obviously groups like DARG, they come and they go, you'll often hear about them being set up. But DARG persisted very much into the 90s. What was the point when you realised that DARG was going to be something more enduring?
Well, I don't think I ever said, oh, now it's going to be more enduring. It's existing. But I think it was the presence and the continuation of having postgraduates.
Mm.
If the supply of postgraduates was cut off, then I think the group would have changed, or it would have had to be something different, and it would have been far fewer people involved in it. It was the postgraduates, and we maintained postgraduates, and postgraduates often wanted to come here because there was a group, because there were regular sessions. Being a postgraduate student at some universities is a very, very solitary business. You're very isolated. So having a team was a way of attracting postgraduates and attracting very good postgraduates. And we've had some superb postgraduates over the years who've then gone on to have very good careers in social psychology, or in the social sciences.
Was there a conscious attempt made to, if you like, sell DARG to the outside world?
I don't know. Derek and I are not by our natures salespersons or promoters, and we would not be involved in that. I suspect Celia and Jonathan are much more at ease with doing things like that. But I really don't know what was done and what wasn't.
Just thinking back to those early days, are there any, or not even necessarily the other days, are there any particular DARG sessions that you think back on as having been particularly memorable or illustrative in some way?
I saw that question and thought, no, I can't think of any. And actually I'm very pleased I can't, because normally when you think of something memorable, you think in terms of people having a blazing row. And it was very friendly.
Okay. So just moving on to you and your research more specifically a little bit, obviously you've covered a wide range of topics in your research, things like persuasion, ideology, rhetoric and so on. Do you see any...
Now, those aren't the wide range. Those are a narrow range. If you said the history of the mind in the 18th century, or added Freud's personality and his development of psychoanalysis and the history of rock and roll, then that does become wide.
Yeah, and from an outside perspective, somebody might look in and say that those are very disparate, those are very disconnected. Do you yourself see any unifying thread connecting them?
I really don't know. The way I tend to do work is to do it and finish and get interested in somebody else. And I don't look back, and it doesn't interest me whether there's a connection. There's never a plan in advance. Do this and then this and then this. It just happens. I would love to believe that they're all very different and that I've gone off in a new direction with a new idea. I suspect if anyone's read them, which I have, since writing I've never willingly read them, I suspect people will say, no, he's still just got the same old ideas. He fools himself if he thinks they're very different. I don't know, and I don't worry.
So, and in your latest work, you've unravelled some of the basic misunderstandings about the work of Kurt Lewin. How did that work come about?
I really don't know. When anyone asks me, why did you do this? Normally I don't have a reason apart from to say, I realised I didn't know much about whatever, and I thought it'd be rather interesting to find out a bit more. And then in finding out a bit more, I think, well, there's a little bit of a gap here or something, yeah. But I can't remember when it was I started reading Levine or why.
Mm-hmm.
Or whether it was actually Levine's work I was reading or I came on to it. I just can't remember. And if you ask me the same about my interest in nationalism or psychoanalysis, the same answer would be given. I was aware I didn't know a lot, and it seemed interesting to find out.
So, just coming back to DARG, how do you think DARG influenced your own development as an academic?
Well, I think the influence of people like Jonathan and Derek has been that you should pay very close attention to language, and the mechanisms of language are very important. They're interested in conversational language, but the same principle applies to written language and to linguistics. You're a bit unfortunate that this interview has come 8 days after I was interviewed by someone who's writing a biography of my PhD supervisor, Henri Tajfel. And we talked, and he was a PhD student of Tajfel, and we talked at length together about his influence on us, his influence on intellectual life of social psychology, and his generation of people and the profundity of his thought. And I realised how much I owe to him and continue to owe to him. I'd never have become an academic if it weren't for him. And the influence of DARG, and I'm sure it's been great, but is nothing like that influence. I can't express it much better, but or in the way which I would, the debt I owe to Tajfel, and what I learned from him in all sorts of intangible ways. So when I came here, I was my mid to late 30s, and a lot of water had flowed under the bridge, and I haven't looked upon DARG as providing the same, it couldn't possibly provide the same impetus as what had come for earlier. In the same way, you Bogdana came here when you were much younger than me, so you have been formed here.
Yeah. So finally, it's the classic end of interview question, but what are you working on at the minute, and what are your plans for the future?
Well, first of all, plans. I've never really had plans. I've just found myself doing something. You know, where I finish something, go for a period of, oh, what am I going to do next? And, well, take advantage. I'd look forward while writing something to that freedom, and then I start reading and think this is interesting. Before any conscious decision, it's almost like I've been mugged by an issue or by a set of problems, or just wanting to find out more. Well, I've just finished a book with Cristina Marinho, who's an ex-student, an ex-member of DARG, on the language of politics and commemoration in Portugal, which I've enjoyed doing. If you ask me, is it more similar to the current interests of DARG or to critical discourse? It's probably critical discourse. It's actually John Richardson of the critical discourse group had the idea of, he's publishing, he's editor of a series of asking Cristina and I to write a book on this, which we've done.
Okay. Well, those are all my questions, so thank you very much, Professor Billig.
No, it's my pleasure. My pleasure, thank you.